I have typed more words in hearing room, 4 than I can count. 31 years as a court reporter, the last 11 contracting for the State Professional Licensing Board, and I could draw the room from memory with my eyes shut. The dais at the front, 3 board members behind a folding table with water pitchers they never drink from, the respondents' table 8 feet back, the gallery chairs behind that, folding metal, the kind that shift and scrape. Fluorescent lights that make everyone look a little ill. A wall clock with a second hand that sticks at the 40-second mark and then jumps. I know that clock the way a man knows a bad tooth. I was there that Tuesday morning because a nurse named Clara Voss was about to lose her license. That was how I understood it walking in. The state board had received a formal complaint from Hargrove, Dorothy Hargrove, chief of nursing at Caldwell Memorial, alleging that Clara had falsified a patient's medication record and performed an intervention outside her sanctioned scope of practice. The board's legal counsel, a man named Pell who dressed like he owned the building, had filed for immediate suspension and permanent revocation. There was a criminal referral attached, which I'd seen maybe twice in 11 years. Pell was not a man who filed criminal referrals unless he expected them to stick. I set up my machine at the stenographer's table to the left of the dais and did not look at Clara Voss. That is a professional habit. You don't look at the respondent before the session opens. You look at your keys, you look at the board, you look at the clock with its broken second hand. It keeps you neutral. Neutrality is the job. I broke the habit after about 4 minutes. She was sitting alone at the respondent's table. No attorney. She had waived her right to counsel in writing, which Pell had already noted for the record in a tone that made it sound like evidence of something. She had a single manila folder in front of her, closed. Her hands were flat on the table on either side of it. She was not fidgeting. She was not looking at Pell or at Hargrove, who was seated in the front row of the gallery behind and to the right. She was looking at the middle distance. Not at the wall, not at the board, just at the space in front of her, with an expression I did not know how to name. Not calm exactly. Something under calm, like a woman who had decided, some time ago and in some other place, that she would not be moved by rooms like this one. I looked away and put my hands on my keys. Pell opened. He was efficient, I'll give him that. The complaint in 30 seconds. Falsified documentation. Unauthorized defibrillation on a patient whose code status was DNR, a pattern of what he called unilateral clinical decisions inconsistent with the respondent's scope. He had 6 exhibits. He entered them one by one in a voice that conveyed he found this tedious, which I think was calculated. Nothing lands harder than boredom delivered by a man in a good suit. Then he asked Clara to respond to the central allegation, the defibrillation. She said, "The documentation I filed was accurate. The patient's code status had been updated 4 hours before the event. The update was not in the primary chart. It was in the electronic addendum system, which the attending and the charge nurse were not aware had populated. I was aware. I made the call. I would make it again." Pell let the silence sit before he answered. "You made a unilateral decision. I made the only decision available," she said. The patient's heart had stopped. I was the only clinician in the room. Her voice was level throughout. Not defiant. Not pleading. Just true, in the way that something can be so plainly true that dressing it up would make it smaller. Hargrove shifted in her chair behind the rail. I caught it in my peripheral vision and made a small note of it that I couldn't have justified if you'd asked me why. The board chair, a Dr. Feld, a retired internist who seemed personally inconvenienced by the proceedings, said they would take a brief statement from the complainant's representative before moving to deliberation. Pell indicated Hargrove would speak. She was already standing. I watched her walk to the front. She was polished, prepared. She had a folder of her own, and she opened it without looking down because she had memorized what she wanted to say. What she said in measured, reasonable language was that Clara Voss had a documented history of acting outside her lane, her word, lane, and that the board had an obligation to protect patients from clinicians, however well-intentioned, who could not be managed by normal institutional oversight. She said well-intentioned with a small sideways tilt of her head that meant the opposite. Clara did not react. Her hand stayed flat on the folder. Feld thanked Hargrove and asked Clara if she had anything further to add before the board went into deliberation. Clara said no. She reached for her folder to close it. That's when the photograph fell. It came out of the back of the folder when she lifted it. The folder was old, the bottom crease had given way, and whatever she had in there shifted forward, and a single laminated card, maybe 3 inches by 4, came out the front and landed face up on the table. She reached for it immediately, smoothly, the way you reach for something you didn't mean to show anyone. She had it back in her hand in 2 seconds. But a man in the third row of the gallery had seen it land. He was in civilian clothes, dark slacks, a gray collared shirt, and he had been so still since he'd come in that I had barely registered him. Medium build, maybe 50, a jaw like a surveyor's instrument. When the photograph landed, something in his face changed. Not alarm, not recognition exactly. Something more specific than that. The way a man looks when he sees, after years, a face he wasn't expecting to see. He watched Clara put the photograph back in the folder. Then he stood, quietly, and said, "Excuse me." He said it to no one in particular. He moved to the aisle, stepped past 2 other observers, pushed through the door to the hall, and was gone. Nobody followed him. Nobody on the dais had really noticed. Pell was reviewing his notes. Feld was talking in a low voice to the board member on his left. Hargrove had turned to say something to her assistant. I noticed because I noticed things. 31 years of sitting in corners and watching. I put my hands back on my keys. The clock stuck at 42 seconds, then jumped. Feld called the room back to order and said the board would take 15 minutes to deliberate. He started to reach for the water pitcher. The hall door opened. The man in the gray shirt came back in. He was not alone. Behind him were 2 younger men, also in civilian clothes, who move the way men move when they're used to moving in formation and have not quite finished being used to it. And behind them was an older man, perhaps 70, silver-haired, in a dark suit, who walked to the front of the gallery and stopped and said, in a voice that did not require projection to fill the room, "I apologize for the interruption. My name is Alderman. I was Admiral Charles Alderman, United States Navy, retired. I was scheduled to appear before this board this afternoon in an unrelated matter. I understand you are deliberating on the case of Petty Officer Clara Voss." Feld blinked at him. "The respondent is—" "I know who she is," Alderman said. "Gunny Reeves has just reminded me. I would ask for 2 minutes before you deliberate. 2 minutes only." Feld looked at Pell. Pell looked at Alderman for a long beat, and then looked at his notes, which told him nothing useful, and then looked back at Alderman and said nothing. Feld said, 2 minutes. Alderman did not have a folder. He stood with his hands at his sides, and he spoke from memory. He said that Clara Voss had served 2 deployments as a Navy hospital corpsman, HM2, attached to a Marine reconnaissance battalion operating in Helmand Province. He said that on her 2nd deployment, during a coordinated ambush that destroyed the forward aid station, she had held the casualty collection point for 9 hours without a physician, without a medevac window, with no resupply. 7 Marines came in. 7 Marines were alive when the window finally opened. He said the citation was classified for 3 years. He said it was declassified in full. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and produced a single folded sheet. He unfolded it without looking at it and set on the rail in front of him. He read her Navy Cross citation aloud. "I am a court reporter. My job is to take down what is said." I kept my hands on the keys. I recorded the words. But I want to tell you something that will not appear in any transcript. I have sat in rooms where lawyers have made arguments that changed lives, where doctors have testified about things that should have been impossible, where men and women have said true things in hard rooms and had those true things not matter. I had typed 1,000 hours in hearing room 4, and I had never once felt the temperature of a room change. The temperature of that room changed. When Alderman finished reading, the man called Gunny Reeves, who had been standing at the end of the gallery row, came to attention. Not theatrically, not slowly. He simply came to attention, in civilian clothes, in a fluorescent lit state licensing room, and stood there. The 2 men behind him did the same. 3 men standing in a folding chair gallery. That was all. No orchestra, no crowd. Clara Voss had not moved. She was sitting at the respondent's table with her hands flat on either side of her folder, and she was looking at the middle distance the same way she had been looking at it when I walked in that morning. Only now I understood what that expression was. It was not calm. It was not patience. It was the particular stillness of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the dust and blood of a 9-hour night that I will never understand, that rooms like this one were not the worst thing, that they could be endured, that she could sit in them and tell the truth and put her hands flat and wait. She had never mentioned the citation. Not to the board. Not to counsel. Not once. Feld set down the water pitcher he had been holding without having opened it. Pell had closed his folder. Hargrove was in the front row of the gallery, and she was looking at the back of Clara's head, and for the first time since the proceedings had opened, she had nothing to say and no folder to open and nowhere to put her eyes. Alderman refolded the citation and returned it to his pocket. He thanked the board for the 2 minutes. He said he hoped the record would be considered in full. He moved back to the gallery and sat down. Feld cleared his throat. He conferred with the board member on his left, then the one on his right for what I timed at 40 seconds. Then he looked at Pell. He said the criminal referral was withdrawn. He said the revocation motion was dismissed. He said the board would issue a written determination clearing the complaint with no finding of misconduct. He said this in the flat, careful language that boards use, the language that sounds like a form being filled out, and he looked at Clara when he said it, and she gave him a single nod. I was looking at Hargrove when the chair spoke. She was still looking at the back of Clara's head, and then, as if the effort had become too great, she looked down at her lap. She did not look up again while I was in that room. Clara gathered her folder. She stood, pushed in the chair, and walked to the hall door without looking at the gallery. She did not look at Alderman. She did not look at Reeves or the 2 men with him. She pushed through the door and was gone. Reeves watched her go. Then he looked at the empty doorway for a moment, just a moment, and he nodded once at it, the way a man nods at something that is finished and correct. I sat at my machine after the room cleared. I had the session on the keys. I had all the words, the procedural language, the motion, the dismissal, the Admiral's 2 minutes, all of it. I sat there looking at it, and then I covered my machine, and I left it, and I walked out into the hall. She was already gone. I finished the transcript that evening, from my notes and from memory, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold. I am 62 years old. I was a staff sergeant, United States Army, 31 years ago, and I never saw a day of anything you would call real service. I pushed paper at Fort Bragg, and I was proud to do it, and I know the difference between what I did and what she did. I typed every word she said in that room. I will not forget one of them.